The truck coughed. It rattled. It wheezed like something that should have been retired a decade ago. And as it rolled slowly into the courthouse parking lot, heads turned. People stared. A few laughed. A woman in a designer coat leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand, her eyes fixed on the rusted vehicle like it was an embarrassment to the entire street. Olivia Hart stepped out. She wore no jewelry, no designer bag, no heels that announced her arrival. She wore simple clothes and carried herself the way she always had. Quietly, purposefully, without performance. And standing at the top of the courthouse steps, flanked by his lawyers and his girlfriend in his borrowed confidence, was Ethan Cole, her husband, the man who had spent 3 years telling anyone who would listen that Olivia was nothing without him, that she was lucky he had stayed as long as he did, that the divorce was mercy. He looked at the truck, he looked at her. And he smirked. His girlfriend Vanessa laughed softly and touched his arm like they had already won. Like today was just the formality before the celebration. They had no idea because the woman climbing those courthouse steps was not the broken, powerless wife they believed her to be. She was the sole owner of an empire that spanned industries they had never even discovered despite years of searching. And in less than 2 hours, everything Ethan Cole had planned, schemed, and stolen for would be turned against him. Like a blade he had sharpened himself. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one drop every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Now, let's go back to where this story truly begins. Olivia's grandmother used to say something that stayed with her long after the old woman was gone. She would sit on the porch in the early morning, watching the sun rise slowly over the fields, and she would say, "The richest tree in the forest is usually the quietest child. The ones that make the most noise are the ones that fall first." Olivia was 12 when she first heard that. She didn't fully understand it then, but life had a way of teaching lessons that classrooms never could. She grew up without much. Not poor in the way that breaks people, but humble in the way that builds them. She learned early that value wasn't visible, that the most important things, integrity, patience, quiet strength, never announced themselves. By the time she was in her mid-20s, she was working for a man named Gerald Oae, a transportation entrepreneur who had spent 40 years building a small logistics company from one truck and a handshake to a regional operation with dozens of vehicles and long-standing contracts. Gerald was 73, childless, and watching his company slowly decline because his health no longer allowed him to run it with the energy it needed. He hired Olivia as an operations manager. Within 18 months, she had reorganized his scheduling systems, renegotiated 3 major contracts, and cut costs significantly without cutting staff. Gerald noticed. He started calling her into meetings she wasn't invited to. He started asking her opinion on decisions she had no formal authority over. One afternoon, he called her into his office, closed the door, and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I've spent 40 years looking for someone who loves the work more than the credit," he said. "I think I finally found her." 2 years later, Gerald Oae passed away peacefully. And in his will, he left his entire company to Olivia Hart with one condition: that she never forget where it came from and that she never let appearances define her judgment of people. She kept the first truck he ever bought. That was the truck outside the courthouse today. She didn't tell anyone about the inheritance. Not because she was ashamed, but because she had watched what sudden visible wealth did to people. It changed relationships. It attracted the wrong attention. It made people treat you differently. Not better, just differently. And not always in ways that served you. So, she kept living simply. She drove the old truck. She wore ordinary clothes. She let the company grow quietly, reinvesting every profit back into expansion. Within 4 years, what Gerald left her had tripled in size. Within 8 years, it had expanded beyond transportation into warehousing, logistics, technology, and supply chain management. She brought in trusted partners, hired brilliant people who believed in the mission, and protected every asset with legal structures so tight that even the best lawyers had difficulty identifying the full scope of what she owned. And through all of it, she told almost no one. Then she met Ethan Cole. Ethan was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately knew which people were worth impressing. He was tall, sharp-dressed, articulate, and magnetic. He had a gift for making you feel like the most important person in the room, right up until the moment you weren't useful to him anymore. They met at a mutual friend's dinner party. Ethan spent the whole evening trying to figure out who Olivia was. She didn't look wealthy. She didn't talk about money. She was warm and thoughtful and interesting, but she didn't carry the markers he usually looked for. He was intrigued. Later, he told his friend she was different from the women he usually met. His friend laughed and said, "She's also the most self-contained person I've ever encountered. Nobody really knows what she does." That mystery more than anything drew Ethan in. In the beginning, he was wonderful, attentive, funny. He sent flowers. He remembered small details. He made her feel seen in ways she hadn't expected. And Olivia, who had spent years pouring everything into her work, found herself opening up to someone for the first time in a long while. They married 18 months after they met. She did not tell him the full truth about her businesses before the wedding. Not because she was hiding it maliciously, but because she wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she owned. She planned to tell him everything once the marriage was settled, once the trust was built, once she was certain she waited too long. Because within 2 years, the man she thought she knew began to change. It started as jokes. "Olivia, you have to let me buy you a new car. That truck is embarrassing." She would laugh it off. "It runs perfectly fine, Ethan. It runs fine. Olivia, it sounds like it's dying every time you start the engine." She laughed again. He laughed, too. It seemed harmless at first, but the jokes became more frequent. Then they became sharper. At dinner parties, he would gesture toward her and say to guests, "My wife keeps us humble," with a laugh. That invited everyone else to laugh too. And they did. And Olivia would smile, but she started noticing something underneath the humor. Ethan was obsessed with appearances. His car had to be impressive. His watch had to be recognized. When they walked into rooms, he needed people to see him a certain way. He spent money they didn't need to spend on things that didn't need to be bought. He complained that Olivia's lifestyle made him look unsuccessful by association. "You don't have to dress like you're apologizing for existing," he told her one evening. She looked at him calmly. "I dressed the way I'm comfortable. You dress like someone who doesn't know what they're worth." She said nothing because she knew exactly what she was worth. He just didn't know yet. Then Vanessa appeared. She arrived in Ethan's life through a business networking event. She was polished, ambitious, and deeply interested in wealthy men. She wore her sophistication like armor, and wielded charm like a weapon. From the moment she and Ethan met, something shifted in him that Olivia could feel before she could prove it. The late nights became more frequent. The explanations became vaguer. He started dressing better, not for Olivia, but for someone else. Olivia didn't confront him immediately. She watched. She listened. She paid attention to patterns the way she had learned to do in business. Quietly. Carefully, without revealing her hand. Then one Tuesday afternoon, she opened their shared household account to review some bills, and she noticed a withdrawal she didn't recognize. It was significant, but not enormous. She flagged it mentally and moved on. A week later, there was another one, then another. Each withdrawal was structured just small enough not to trigger immediate alerts. But together over 6 months, they added up to a number that made her hands go still. When she finally calculated the total, she didn't say a word. She quietly hired an investigator. What the investigator found over the following weeks was not just infidelity. It was architecture. Ethan and Vanessa had constructed something deliberate and methodical. They had been researching Olivia, her history, her past employers, her properties, her affiliations. They were building a picture, trying to understand exactly how much she was worth and where it was held. "He's been accessing your personal email account," the investigator told her in a meeting. "Not recently. He Stopped when he probably realized there wasn't much there. But about 18 months ago, he went through everything. Olivia was quiet for a moment. What was he looking for? Asset documentation, business registrations, anything that could tell him what you own and where it is. She leaned back slowly, and what did he find? The investigator shook his head. From what I can tell, very little. Your company structures are held through several layers that wouldn't be immediately visible to someone without very specific legal and financial knowledge. She nodded. The investigator continued, there's more. He's been using some of the joint account money to service personal debts, business investments that failed badly. He owes several creditors significant sums. Our assessment is that he's hoping the divorce settlement will give him enough to clear those debts and walk away clean. Olivia exhaled slowly. What kind of numbers are we talking? When he told her, something inside her went very cold. Not from fear, from clarity. She called her lead attorney the same evening. His name was Marcus Audi, and he had handled the legal architecture of her businesses for years. He was brilliant, precise, and deeply loyal to her. He's going to file for divorce, she told him. And he's going to try to claim a share of assets I built before and during this marriage. I need everything buttoned up before he makes his move. Marcus was already ahead of her. I've been watching the pattern. I think you should also know that he's been speaking to a law firm that specializes in contested asset divorces. They're quite aggressive. Good, she said. Marcus paused. Good. If they're aggressive, they'll overplay their hand. And when they do, we'll be ready. She spent the next 6 weeks doing something she had been doing her entire adult life. She prepared, she documented, she reviewed every legal structure, ensured every company ownership record was unimpeachable, and built a case file so comprehensive that her legal team said they had never seen anything like it from a private individual. She was ready before Ethan even filed. The night he came home to end the marriage, Olivia was sitting at the kitchen table, reading. She heard the front door open. She heard 2 sets of footsteps. She didn't move. Ethan walked in. Vanessa walked in behind him. Olivia looked up. We need to talk, Ethan said. She looked at him steadily. I can see that. He put the divorce papers on the table with deliberate force, like he was making a statement, like he wanted the sound to mean something. Vanessa stood near the door with her arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone watching a show they had already rehearsed. I've spoken to my lawyers, Ethan said. This doesn't have to be difficult. You cooperate. We divide things fairly and we both move on. Olivia looked down at the papers. She didn't reach for them immediately. Fairly, she repeated quietly. I've been patient, Olivia, but we both know this marriage has been over for a long time. She looked up at him. What do you think? You're going to walk away with, Ethan? He smiled. It was a practice smile. Confident and slightly pitying enough to be comfortable. She didn't respond to that. She looked past him at Vanessa. Then back at him. You should leave. Tonight, she said. Both of you, Ethan. Straightened. This is my house. No. She said simply. It isn't. That stopped him. She stood up from the table, picked up the divorce papers, and walked out of the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Ethan say to Vanessa, she doesn't even know what's about to hit her. Olivia kept walking. If you're still watching up to this point, type I'm still here in the comments section. Right now. This story is only getting more intense and we want to know you're with us. Olivia had a conversation with her assistant James 3 days before the hearing. James had worked with her for 11 years. He was not just an assistant. He was a trusted confidant, someone who knew the full scope of her world and had protected that knowledge with complete discretion. The jet, she said, I want it. At the courthouse on the day of the hearing. I need a document delivered and I want it delivered from the aircraft. James looked at her with a slight smile. You're planning something. I'm planning the truth, she said. Nothing more. Should I inform the rest of the team? Tell them to prepare the full documentation portfolio. Every company. Every registered asset, every verified contract. I want it all in physical binders and in digital form. Every single one. James nodded. This is going to be quite a moment. She looked at him. It was always going to come to this. I just wanted it to come at the right time. The morning of the divorce hearing was cool and clear. Ethan arrived with his legal team in 2 matching dark vehicles. He wore a well-fitted suit and the expression of a man who believed he had already calculated the outcome. Vanessa was beside him, elegant and composed, wearing a small, satisfied smile. They stood at the top of the courthouse steps. They saw the truck roll in and the laughter started first between them, then spreading like a ripple outward among people nearby who had heard whispers about this case. Olivia stepped out of the truck without hurry. She walked up the steps. As she passed Ethan, their eyes met for just a moment. He leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, last chance to make this easy on yourself. She looked at him calmly and kept walking. Inside, the courtroom settled into session. Ethan's legal team moved first. They were polished and deliberate. They presented a portrait of Olivia as a woman of modest means, a homemaker who had benefited from the marriage, who had contributed little financially, and whose primary claim to any assets was based on time spent in the union rather than any demonstrable wealth of her own. They produced bank records from their joint accounts. They produced records of the household expenses. They produced a summary of what they claimed to be her total assets. A number that was, to put it plainly, laughably incomplete. Ethan sat there nodding slightly at each point. The way a man nods when he Believes a story is going exactly as written. Then Marcus Admi stood up. He didn't rush. He placed his hands on the table and looked toward the judge with the quiet assurance of someone who had been waiting patiently for a very specific moment. Your Honor, he said. We appreciate the opposing team's presentation. We now like to offer a more complete picture. What followed was methodical, meticulous, and devastating. Company by company, holding by holding. Warehouse by warehouse, fleet by fleet. Marcus presented the full scope of Olivia Hart's business empire. Everything registered before the marriage, everything built during it. Through structures that held it entirely in her name, protected by legal frameworks that Ethan's lawyers had apparently not been sophisticated enough to locate. The numbers grew. The room grew quieter. Ethan's posture changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Then visibly. His shoulders dropped. He leaned toward his lawyer. His lawyer leaned back toward him. What is this? He whispered. His lawyer didn't have an answer. I'm going to need a moment. Ethan's lead attorney said out loud. Which drew a hard look from the judge. You'll have a moment during recess, the judge said coolly. Please continue. Counselor. Marcus continued. The second phase was even more precise. The investigators had assembled a complete trail of every fraudulent document Ethan had submitted, every forged signature, every manipulated record. Each one was placed before the court with its corresponding proof of falsification. Every lie had a document beside it. Every claim had its collapse waiting. Ethan's face, which had been going pale during the first phase, was now difficult to read. Something had left it. The architecture of confidence he had built over months of preparation. What was underneath was not quite panic, but something close to it. Then came the recess. It was during those 20 minutes outside the courthouse that James received the call. He walked to Olivia and said quietly, the contracts from the northern expansion are ready for final authorization. I've had them brought in. She nodded. The jet just landed, he added. They walked outside together. When the jet came into view, sleek, branded with the insignia of Olivia's flagship company, the crowd of observers, legal staff, and onlookers outside the courthouse went visibly still. The aircraft was not ostentatious, but it was unmistakably hers, not chartered, not borrowed from a business partner, registered in the name of one of her subsidiaries, every detail verifiable. James walked to it calmly. He returned carrying a portfolio of documents, nodded to Olivia, and they walked back toward the entrance. Someone nearby said loudly enough to carry, Is that her plane? A court staff member who had been watching said quietly, I think it is. Ethan was standing near the courthouse entrance. He saw the jet. He saw James. He looked at Olivia. And the smirk, the one that had been sitting on his face since she arrived in that old truck, was gone. Not just faded, gone. Replaced by something he probably did not know how to name. Olivia looked at him for a moment as she walked past. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Back inside, the session resumed, and then came something no one had fully anticipated. Not even Ethan. Vanessa. It turned out that Vanessa had been carrying a secret of her own for the better part of 2 years. She had been recording conversations, not out of loyalty to Olivia, but out of self-preservation. She had watched Ethan's financial situation deteriorate. She had watched his desperation grow, and she had made a private calculation that if his schemes collapsed, she did not want to be holding any part of the weight. Through an intermediary, she had provided Olivia's legal team with recordings, emails, and documentation that covered the full scope of what she and Ethan had planned together. Conversations in which Ethan discussed exactly how to manipulate financial disclosures. Conversations in which he described his strategy for claiming assets that were never jointly held. Conversations in which he spoke about Olivia with a coldness that, when read aloud in a courtroom, made several people in the gallery visibly uncomfortable. You genuinely believed she had nothing. His own words said back to him through the speakers. That's the mistake you kept making. You kept judging her by the truck. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Ethan sat very still. He didn't look at Vanessa. Vanessa didn't look at him. The judge looked at both of them with an expression that required no further elaboration. The ruling came later that afternoon. It was by any measure complete. Ethan received none of Olivia's companies, none of the assets he had claimed. The court found that his representations had been fraudulent in multiple areas and referred the matter to the appropriate authorities for further investigation into his financial conduct. The debts, the ones he had planned to transfer onto Olivia, remained his entirely. Penalties were applied, and everything he had built his strategy on dissolved in the space of a single afternoon. Outside afterward, as people filed out and the day's proceedings wound down, Ethan found himself standing near Olivia's truck. He looked at it for a long moment. Then she came out of the building. He turned toward her. The confidence was entirely gone now. He looked like a man who had been walking toward a destination for years, only to discover at arrival that the destination had never existed. Olivia, he said. She stopped. He struggled for a moment, then quietly. I didn't know. She looked at him steadily. I know you didn't. You could have told me years ago. It might have changed things, she said. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. Her voice was measured and still. If knowing what I owned was what would have changed things, Ethan, then you've just told me everything I needed to know about why it was always going to end here. He had no response to that. She looked at the truck, the old, battered, coughing, rattling truck that had carried her through more than he would ever understand. This truck, she said quietly, was the very first vehicle in what became my company. Gerald bought it With money he saved for 2 years. He drove it himself for the first 6 months. Because he couldn't yet afford a driver. When he gave the company to me, he kept this truck out of the formal inventory. He said it wasn't an asset. It was a memory, a reminder. She looked back at Ethan, a reminder that every empire has a beginning that doesn't look like an empire, and that the people who forget that always end up underestimating the wrong person. She opened the door of the truck. The engine rattled to life. She pulled out of the parking lot slowly. Past the jet, past the remaining onlookers, past the cameras, past all of it, in the exact same truck she had arrived in, and she did not look back. Months later, when the legal processes were fully resolved and the final chapters of the case were closed, James asked her something over coffee in her office. The room looked out over a logistics facility that processed thousands of shipments every week. Through the window, you could see trucks, new ones, clean and branded, moving in organized patterns below. Do you regret the secrecy? He asked, not telling him earlier. She considered the question seriously. She always considered questions seriously. I regret that. I hoped it wouldn't matter, she said. I thought love would make appearances irrelevant. I should have known better. Not because secrets are wise, but because love that depends on what you're hiding was never strong enough to last. She looked out at the trucks. The secrecy wasn't the mistake. The mistake was marrying someone whose sense of worth was entirely external. You can't build a real life with someone who only sees value in what the world applauds. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he called again. His lawyers want to discuss a settlement on the debt matter. She nodded once. Refer them to Marcus. She turned back to her desk. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And that more than anything, more than the jet, more than the empire, more than the courtroom. Victory was what had always sustained her. Not the arrival, the building, the quiet, purposeful, daily act of creating something real out of nothing, the way Gerald had taught her, the way her grandmother had predicted without knowing how. The richest tree in the forest, the quietest one. There is something this story carries that outlasts the drama of the courtroom and the details of the divorce. It is this. The most dangerous assumption any person can make is that they fully understand another person's worth based on what that person chooses to show. Ethan Cole spent years looking at Olivia Hart and calculating a value based on surface. A truck, plain clothes, quiet habits, and every one of those calculations was wrong. Not because she was hiding something to deceive him, but because she had learned long before they met that real value does not need to perform. And the cost of his miscalculation was not just legal and financial. It was total. Everything he plotted against her became in the end a trap he had built for himself. Every forged document, every secret account, every careful scheme, each one became evidence. Each one became a mechanism of His own undoing. He spent years constructing the architecture of her destruction and lived to watch it become the structure of his own. That is not unusual. It is in fact almost inevitable. Because greed that is rooted in contempt for others is almost always blind to the consequences that contempt creates. Olivia did not destroy Ethan. Ethan destroyed Ethan. She simply prepared well enough that when the moment came, the truth could speak for itself. And the truck, that old rattling, smoke-coughing truck, sat outside the courthouse on that day, not as evidence of poverty or neglect, but as something far more powerful. It was the beginning. Made visible, the origin kept present, a deliberate choice by a woman who had never once forgotten where she came from, and who had no interest in pretending the journey had started anywhere other than where it actually did. Wealth that forgets its origin becomes arrogance. Arrogance becomes blindness. Blindness becomes exactly the kind of vulnerability that Ethan fell into. Absolutely certain of a story he had written entirely in his own imagination, unable to see the reality standing right in front of him every single day. The lesson, if there is one to carry, is simpler than it might seem. Do not judge lives by their visible surfaces. Do not assume that simplicity is poverty, or that quietness is powerlessness, or that the person who does not announce themselves has nothing to announce. Some of the most substantial people in any room are the ones you did not notice when you walked in. And sometimes the most powerful move available to you is patience. Not passive patience. Not waiting and hoping, but active, prepared, deliberate patience. The kind that gathers evidence while others gather confidence. The kind that builds cases while others build performances. The kind that walks into the most important room of a crisis already holding everything it needs. That was Olivia. That is the story. And if it resonated with you, if something in it reminded you of a moment in your own life when you were underestimated, or when you watched someone mistake appearance for reality, or when you realized that the quietest person in the room was the one worth listening to, then this story did exactly what it was meant to do. Thank you sincerely for watching all the way to the end. It means more than you know. Drop in the comments what part of this story hit you the hardest. Was it the courtroom reveal, the moment with the jet, Olivia's final words to Ethan, or something quieter? Something in the way she carried herself through it all? We read every single comment. And we would genuinely love to hear from you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Click that subscribe button and join this community, because stories like this 1. Stories built on real human wisdom, real emotion, and real consequence are what we do here every single week. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And we will see you in the next